we have ice cores. And these ice cores will show us that every time we've had a natural warming, then thousands of years later, we get an increase in carbon dioxide. So again, it's the warming that drives the atmospheric carbon dioxide content, not the cooling. Atmospheric carbon dioxide is released from oceans when we have a warming. That's called Henry's law. We've known that from chemistry for a very long period of time.
Hello and welcome to The Focus. Today on The Focus, we're joined by Professor Ian Plimer, geologist, academic, author, and one of Australia's most outspoken critics of mainstream climate policy. Professor Plimer has spent decades arguing that natural geological processes, rather than human activity, dominate climate variability. Whether one agrees with him or not, his work has shaped public debate and forced a closer examination of the assumptions underpinning climate science, energy policy, and resource management. Our goal today is straightforward: to test ideas, examine evidence, and unpack the complex relationship between climate, energy, industry, and geopolitics, without partisanship and without fear or favour. Ian, welcome to The Focus.
Well, thank you for having me on The Focus.
Ian, you've long argued that natural geological processes drive climate variability more than human activity. What specific empirical evidence do you consider most compelling for this position, and why do you think mainstream climate science interprets the data differently?
Well, I'm glad you've used the word evidence, because that's what I tie my conclusions to. And if you're a real scientist, if the evidence accumulates, changes, then you change your conclusion, and that's what you have to do. For me, the evidence is the past. We've had massive climate changes in the past. We've always had climate change, but we've had massive changes in the past, far greater than anything we're enjoying today, and it's never been related to carbon dioxide. For example, in the North Flinders Ranges of South Australia, we have two major ice ages within which there were many periods of glaciation and many periods of interglaciation. And glaciation is when the ice expands, and interglacial is when the ice contracts. Now, these ice ages left kilometres of ice at the equator at sea level. And we know from the chemistry of the associated rocks that the atmosphere must have had more than 10% carbon dioxide in it. So carbon dioxide could not possibly drive warming. It plays no part at all. The second thing is that we have, on a much shorter timescale, we have ice cores. And these ice cores will show us that every time we've had a natural warming, then thousands of years later, we get an increase in carbon dioxide. So again, it's the warming that drives the atmospheric carbon dioxide content, not the cooling. Atmospheric carbon dioxide is released from oceans when we have a warming. That's called Henry's law. We've known that from chemistry for a very long period of time. And the third thing is that we've had very significant climate changes over the last, say, 2,000 years. In Minoan times, it was warmer than now. Then it got cooler. And then at the time of Jesus, it was about 4 or 5 degrees Celsius warmer than now. Yet we didn't have industry pumping carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Then we went into the Dark Ages, and these are the times when the Vikings felt it, and it got so cold that places like Iceland and Greenland were totally isolated. The Vikings couldn't expand and struggled to survive. And then we had the medieval warming when it was about 5 degrees warmer than now. And we know from the Vikings that they grew wheat and barley and had sheep and cattle on Greenland. That was a natural warming. We weren't putting out carbon dioxide from industry into the atmosphere. And then it cooled down. And that cooling was called the Little Ice Age. And for some strange reason, after the Little Ice Age, it warmed up. And that warming started in 1850. And since 1850, we've had a slight warming, then we've had a very slight cooling, then we've had another slight warming, then we've had a slight cooling, and now we're having a slight warming again. So these, the latest modern warming, you may well argue, oh, this is due to humans putting out carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Well, what about the previous warmings? And why in that period of time did we have both warmings and coolings? And why is it that when we do the experiments and put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it's the first 100 parts per million that is really vital for warming, and after that it has very, very little effect. So we've got it on all time scales, a modern time scale, a historical time scale, the Ice Age time scale, which goes back hundreds of thousands of years, and on the geological time scale. So if in the past carbon dioxide hasn't driven warming, then unless you change all the laws of physics and chemistry, it won't change it in the present. So you will be very lucky to find a geologist who will argue the contrary. And that's because we use the evidence of the past, and that's driven by processes of physics and chemistry which haven't changed.
Wow, you've raised a lot of things here. I mean, one of the things that comes into my mind is, having discussed this issue with people on the land, people who are pastoralists, farmers, whatever, they've noticed that there is a drying and warming up in Australia. And they keep their records, so they can tell just how climate has changed during their period on the land as well as their forebears. So can we say for certain that what we're putting into the atmosphere, what we're putting into the oceans, aren't having an effect? I mean, if we go back to the Industrial Revolution, many people on the green side of the ledger would say from 1700, everything's just gone, in a sort of hockey stick curve upwards in terms of warming. What can you say that's evidence-based with regard to those sort of claims? Because those are the claims that make the headlines. Those are the claims that people hold on to.
Well, a number of points there. Firstly, it has never been demonstrated that human emissions of carbon dioxide drive global warming. This is a point that Patrick Moore, the founder of Greenpeace, makes. It has never been shown that human emissions drive global warming. The second thing is, you mentioned the farmers. The farmers are at the whim of the weather. Now, the weather is accidental as well as it's cyclical. Now, the cycles that affect farmers are the El Nino cycles, and you never hear climate catastrophists talking about what drives El Nino, but if you talk to volcanologists, you will see that every time we get an El Nino, we get an eruption in the oceans of basalt. 1 cubic kilometre of basalt holds enough energy to create 30 hurricanes. And we have known this for a long while. We know that there are nearly 70,000 kilometres of mid-ocean ridges where we have submarine volcanoes. We know that there are nearly 3.5 million submarine volcanoes, some of which are extinct and many of which are still active. So there are many features that meteorologists do not look at. They don't look at the past. They don't look at what happens beneath their feet, such as the leakage of carbon dioxide out of rocks. And they don't look at where the heat comes from. And a lot of the heat comes from the cooling planet and from volcanoes that are cooling down. So there's a very strong view amongst volcanologists that El Ninos, which affect the farmers, are driven by submarine volcanicity. The second thing is that we know that climate is sometimes accidental. This is due to where you might have a massive eruption, but also a lot of climate change is cyclical. And the cycles that affect farmers are the 60-year marine cycles and the 18.6-year lunar tidal nodes. And those 60-year cycles were so prominent that you can see them in the temperature records, which haven't been contaminated. And these are ones where people haven't adjusted them, contemporary records of rural areas. And you see this 60-year cycle. And it was so prominent that the Chinese used it to construct their calendar. They were aware of 60-year cycles and how that affected their farming. So we have cycles of climate. Now, the big ones are every 400 million years. This is when we pull apart and stitch back together the continents. Another big one is 143 million years, and that's when We have the bad galactic address. Another one has just been discovered, and I think it needs validation, but there's a suggestion there's a 2.4 million year cycle based on Mars. The ones we have known about for more than 100 years are the Milankovitch cycles, and they're every 100,000, 40,000 and 20,000 years. And this is when the Earth gets closer to or further from the sun, and that drives the current glaciations which we see. And I'll come back to that in a second. And then we have solar cycles, which go through grand solar minimum and grand solar maximum. We're heading towards a grand solar minimum. They are every 10,000 years, 217 years, 88 years, and 22 years. We have our lunar tidal nodes. That's when we push warm water into the Arctic. And so just look at when the Northwest Passage is opened up. And that's when we pushed warm water into the Arctic. And then I mentioned the 60-year cycles and the El Nino, which is a bit more random. So in the last couple of 100,000 years, we have gone from glaciation, and that's when we were closer to the sun, into an interglacial, which started 14,400 years ago. We got to the peak of that interglacial 4,000 years ago. And since then, we have been cooling down. And during that cooling, we have seen an increase in carbon dioxide, and we've seen hot spots, warm times like Minoan, Roman, medieval and modern times. So the question which the climate catastrophists have never answered is which part of the modern warming is natural and which part is due to humans. And if you use the figure that you use, 1700, then that was pre-industrial revolution, but that was also in the peak of the Little Ice Age. This is when people were skating on the Thames. This is when the Dutch masters painted the hoarfrosts. This is when we had barbecue oxen on the Thames. And we started to warm up at 1850. Now, that warming was after we started to put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but most of the carbon dioxide that humans have put in the atmosphere went in after 1945. And since 1945, we've had cooling and warming. So it's not possible that those emissions since 1945 have driven warming, because we've also had cooling. Since 1700, we've also had 3 periods of warming and 3 periods of cooling. It's not possible that human emissions drive warming because we've also got cooling. So we have the mantra that if something happens in today's life, then this has got to be due to us. Oh, we've got bushfires. That's due to global warming. No, most bushfires are due to arsonists. The second largest number of bushfires come from lightning strikes. If you look at history, you will see that the greatest number of bushfires occurred in Australia in 1939 and 1851. Geoffrey Blaney writes about this. If you look at floods, well, the reason why we have flooding on floodplains is they're called floodplains, and the floodplains built up by detritus from previous floods, and they gave us detritus from far, far bigger floods than anything we see today. The reason why we get flooding in floodplains is that we've built on them, and we've stopped the proportion, or we've changed the proportion of runoff to soakage. So if you build on a floodplain, one word there should say danger, you're going to get flooded again. If we look at hot weather, then we've had the hottest weather was in the 1930s. And in the 1890s, it wasn't in modern times. We know that. We have measurements. And unless you adjust the measurements, which is what has happened, if you adjust the primary measurements, you can get the story you wanted. This November was the coldest November we've had since, I think it was about 1917. And that was in Adelaide. So you have to always look at the past. And if you say that this is the hottest day that we've got on record, you've got to say since when. If the records start from the time of Jesus, the answer is no. If the records started yesterday, the answer is yes. It's very much the use of the language, and you can frighten people witless by using language, but you have to use data, and you have to use measurements, and you have to use the past. Otherwise, you get a story that's totally erroneous. Now, unfortunately, for the catastrophists, we live in very boring times. We're in a a period of time when it's warm. It's called an interglacial. We're in one of the warmer periods of the interglacial because of solar activity, yet we're in a long-term trend of cooling, which has been going on for 4,000 years. And we have a period where we are reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's been happening for the last 20% of time. That's because we've been sequestering carbon dioxide into life, into limestone, into muddy sediments, into coals, into oils. So we've gone from nearly 1% carbon dioxide 500 million years ago to 0.04%. And if we halved it, we would kill all vegetation. So time is the killer of all of these catastrophe arguments.
Okay, so just a couple of points on what you've said. I mean, we've never had as many human beings on the planet before. And most of those human beings don't want to live a Neolithic lifestyle. They don't want to be cave dwellers like our ancestors. They want to have the modern lifestyle. They want to have their iPhones, their flat screen TVs, and soon enough they'll want their humanoid robots and all the other good things that come from modern technology. But isn't that a problem of sorts? You know, it may not be a climactic problem, but the amount of emissions that we are pumping into the atmosphere from developing new industries and proliferating those industries, doesn't the pollution itself have an environmental or ecological impact, a negative one?
Well, you've raised a lot of points there. Yes, we have the greatest population of humans this planet has ever seen. However, we are not the dominant life force. The dominant life force is beneath your feet, and that's in the top 4 kilometres of the crust, and they are called bacteria. And bacteria are the most important life form on planet Earth. The second thing is we humans, over the last 200 years, have developed longevity. We never had it before. We've had far less disease. We've had far fewer people killed from disasters. Now, 200 years ago, the same number of people killed from earthquakes and volcanoes is the same number of people we get today. But the same number of people 200 years ago were greatly affected by floods and drought and starvation. And we have reduced the killing of people by 90%. And this is killing by disasters. The third thing is that the chances of a child being born and living to the term of their natural life now is very, very high compared with 200 years ago. So the planet is a far better place. Why is it a far better place? Because we've used coal. And why has coal made this effect, followed by petroleum? Well, we burn the coal. We've got energy. We've got very cheap energy. And by burning coal, we're putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That carbon dioxide is plant food. About 30% of it is very quickly recycled in plants, and the other 70% stays in the atmosphere for a short period of time. That is not pollution. We're putting carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. When we're burning materials, we're putting carbon dioxide where it came from. We once had 20% carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's 0.04%. Where did it go? It went into limestone, from which we make cement. It went into coal and oil, which we burn to make cheap energy. It went into life, which when it decomposes, releases gases back into the atmosphere. So we're living in the very, very best times ever to be human. We live longer, we eat better, we have less disease, and that is because of cheap energy. We are polluting the planet, and the main pollutant is plastics, and these come down the 8 giant rivers coming into the oceans. Most of these plastics come from third world countries. It is growing economies that actually pollute the waterways and pollute the air with chemicals that are synthetic chemicals. The best way to stop that pollution is to have a wealthier planet. Now, we see that. We have had a very slight increase in the atmospheric carbon dioxide content over the last 50 years. As a result, we've seen the greening of the planet. As a result, many virgin areas of forest have grown because they've got more plant food. We've also got much better harvests. And that's partly due to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the slight increase, but it's also due to fertilisers and better farm practices. So we're actually cutting down less forest now than we did 50 years ago because of the fact that we can afford fertilisers, which third world countries can't. We've also had the natural fertilisation due to the carbon dioxide we put into the planet. So the greatest pollutants are complex chemicals, which are destroying the environment. Now, we are importing a lot of these chemicals from third world countries. And the main ones we import are highly toxic chemicals used in glues and resins, in turbine blades and in solar panels. We are importing these from China. These chemicals stay in the soils permanently, and there are heavy metals like cadmium, lead, selenium, tellurium that we're leaving in our soils. So, yes, we are polluting the planet. And yes, we did that when we were a third world country, but now in a first world country, you have such strict legislation, such incredibly accurate chemical analytical techniques, and community pressure not to have that pollutant. But we are having pollution coming from third world countries, and we are beneficiaries of that because we're buying products from third world countries. So hypocrisy is the word that enters my mind.
Okay, so Ian, getting back to a point that you just mentioned, and it's a point that's crossed my desk quite some time ago, and I was actually taken aback by it. So maybe you can confirm this, but you were saying that the slight increase in carbon dioxide that we're currently going through is greening the Earth. Now, there is a part of the Earth that seems to be greening at a, well, I don't know, I wouldn't say alarming rate, but a surprising rate, and that is the Sahara. So, do you see that parts of the world now that had been infertile for a long period of time, at least 400,000 years, I think thereabouts when it comes to the Sahara, are starting to show signs of reversal and recovery? And what would that mean for a place like Australia? We're just one great big desert in the middle of the in the Pacific, you know. So, what does it mean for us and our climate variability moving forward?
Well, agriculturalists for many years have done experiments in glass houses with carbon dioxide, and they pumped carbon dioxide into glass houses. The optimum amount is about 3 or 4 times what we have in the atmosphere at present. And that's the optimum for plant growth. So much so that with that information, many agriculturalists now burn propane gas and the exhaust fumes go into a glass house. These exhaust fumes are carbon dioxide and water vapor, and that stimulates growth, and it means you can have a longer growing season in winter because it's warmer inside. So we've known that for a long while now. What's happening naturally in the Sahara is that we are greening the Sahara. It's not the first time it's been green. It's been green many times in the geological past, and it will be in the future. Many parts of Australia are now desert, but we can see fossils showing that these were once tropical areas. So climate always changes. We have many parts north of Lake Frome in South Australia where we have fossils that are showing that we had tropical vegetation there. We have a topography of Australia showing that we once had heavy rainfall. And so we have flat country that had meandering river systems, and this flat country had been completely eroded and weathered by high rainfall, and then it's been uplifted. So you have hilly dissected country with meandering river systems in them. A good example of that would be Arkaroola in the far north Flinders Ranges. So this is telling us that climate always changes. We go from areas that were desert into tropical areas and back again. This depends very much upon the rainfall, but it depends upon where the continent lies, and it depends upon what the climate cycles are giving us. Now, Australia has had the advantage over the last 100 million years of moving northwards. We've also had the great advantage of pushing New Zealand out into the Pacific and giving them near well-earned earthquakes and volcanoes. And that's been happening for 100 million years. And we're still opening up the Tasman Sea, which is why we have volcanoes like Ball's Pyramid and Lord Howe Island and Norfolk Island sitting in the middle of the Tasman. But Australia has been moving northwards. Now, as a result of that, we've changed ocean currents. As a result of that, we've come closer to the equator. As a result of that, our climate has changed. So just because we've got a desert now doesn't mean we've always had a desert and always will have a desert. The planet is dynamic, and what would worry me is that if the climate doesn't change, the view of our climate catastrophists is that the climate is changing and we humans are doing that. Well, I'm sorry, folks, we live on a dynamic planet. It has always changed. I would be worried if it didn't change. Then, in this period of stasis, we would, I think, have serious problems.
You know, it's certainly an interesting conversation because, quite frankly, it becomes political very quickly when you think about the deeper aspects of all of this. So, for those of our audience who may think that the world had always had some sort of Eden-esque, um, non-variable temperature setting, and what all the environmentalists are clamoring for at the moment is to get back to that Eden. They're getting back. They want to go back to something that, in their own minds, existed many thousands of years ago, perhaps. Pre-industrial life. How do you then? I mean, how do you account for this sort of notion? And how has something that obviously, I know I'm going to get into a lot of trouble with some people listening in, but how do you account for the fact that this rubbish is actually now sold as fact? Because you talk about the climate alarmists and the people who are driving a lot of what we're seeing at the moment come from that area. What do you think they want to get back to? I mean, they're pulling up, or they're giving us policies that are driving electricity prices through the roof. We've been told here in South Australia that the Malinowskis government, is energy independent from the rest of Australia. And yet, when I have a look at my power bills, I would imagine that since sunshine is free and wind is free, that the bills should come in at a marginal rate, not at the top rate. So, what is actually going on in all of this?
My God, you've covered some topics there. Um, we have, for the last 50 years, had a dumbing down of our education system where people have less knowledge and people lack the ability to think critically. They go to Wikipedia as a source of information. It's not knowledge. Look me up on Wikipedia. In the first line, they have my birth date wrong. You can get the birth date right. It's public knowledge. You can easily find it. So people will go instantly to Wikipedia, and more than every time I use Wikipedia on a subject I know something about, I can say that's demonstrably wrong. So the first thing is we've had a dumbing down of our education system. The second thing is that for the last 50 or 80 years, we have had a collapse of Christianity in Western countries. And we now have a society where there are very few people who actually are Christian, very few people who have faith, yet the environmental movement has all the hallmarks of Christianity. It's a replacement of Christianity. It's replacing by using the concepts of redemption, of paying indulgences, of having their high priests, of having their holy book, which is the IPCC, which no one has read, and I don't know why you'd want to read the latest one. It's nearly 4,000 pages long, and most of it is science, and none of it demonstrates that human emissions drive global warming anyway. So we have had a fundamental change in society, and this now means that we're using the processes of Christianity, such as guilt and such as redemption and such as sin, to attack modern society. Now, to get back to Eden is an interesting concept because there was never an Eden. There was never an Eden which we can demonstrably say from the past. Yet the Bible has a lot of stories which have an element of truth about them. There is the burning bush. I have seen it in Turkey, and this is the spontaneous ignition of the leakage of petroleum gases from the soil. There is a great flood. We have very strong geological evidence that there was a great flood 7,400 years ago, and this was when the North Anatolian Fault moved. The sea levels, which had risen after the end of the last glaciation, were very high, and water went from the Marmara Sea into the Black Sea Basin. There was agriculture in the Black Sea Basin. There were villages. We have found those by dredging using the same ships that are used for investigating mid-ocean ridges and volcanoes and mid-ocean ridges. We have found those. We've found these villages. We've got the date of the soils there, the date of the wood in the villages. We can see soils that are covered by turbulent sediments. This ended up as a Sumerian myth, the Epic of Gilgamesh. It ended up as a Noah myth. And in that was a story of sin, of goodness, of saving. It's a moral story, but it was an actual event. We've had a parting of the waters in the Red Sea. We know that happens. You know, you get a parting of the waters just before a tsunami. And it was a tsunami that wiped out the Pharaoh's armies. So, and there's quite a lot written on this. So we have a lot of biblical stories which are based on something that was factual, and that includes the Garden of Eden, based on something that was factual, but had a moral overtone put to it. Now, the Garden of Eden was when we had warm, wet times, and we had agriculture in parts of Mesopotamia and Sumeria, which could only thrive in higher rainfall. Now, we had those areas become desert. We know that because the crops changed, and once you've got salty soils, you have to change your crops. The second thing is that we lost agricultural cities due to the loss of fertile lands. So we know we once had a Garden of Eden. So these Christian myths still hang around in people's minds. Now, it was no Garden of Eden on the planet in the Dark Ages. This is when the average longevity of humans was about 37 years. This is when you had to have multiple children because most of them died from disease. The year 535 and 536 AD were the worst years to be alive. This was at the beginning of the Dark Ages. This is when we filled the atmosphere with volcanic dust from Papua New Guinea and Central America. We had a cooling down, we had tsunamis, we had acid rain, we had people cough themselves to death. That wasn't the Garden of Eden times. So if people want to go back to the Garden of Eden times, the question to ask them is when? Is it 200 years ago? The answer is no. Is it 1,000 years ago? Well, perhaps it was warmer than then. And we know that in the warm times that we've had in the past, like in the medieval times or like in the Roman times, we had an increase in population, we had a decrease in warfare, we could feed people. In Europe, for example, in medieval times, we had so much good weather and so much rain that you could have 2 harvests a year. And with all the excess wealth, the great cathedrals and monasteries and universities were built. So this idea of having a Garden of Eden is a myth. In South Australia, we're not energy independent at all. We rely on coal-fired power from Queensland, which comes down through interconnectors, and it ends up eventually in South Australia. If we were energy independent, we'd get rid of those interconnectors straight away and see how you thrive on sunbeams and sea breezes, and we can't. The wind and the sunshine is not free. We have to build the infrastructure. So that's a great myth that has been peddled for a long while. So this environmental movement is not based on history. It's not based on science. It's not based on logic. I think it's a mechanism whereby unelected people can have control. And these unelected people can control every single one of our movements. And that word movements, now I blend into something else. At the current COP conference that's on in Brazil, there was a motion put forward that we get rid of using toilet paper because it's polluting the environment. We have to chop down trees to give us the fibre in the toilet paper. They don't give us an alternative. The second thing is at this COP conference, they ran out of hamburgers. So people are eating meat. So we have a movement of unelected people who want power over us. These are hypocrites. They've got no skin in the game. They don't have to face an election. They don't have to pay for it themselves, and they can go to a COP meeting in a private jet and then wag their finger at us about using petroleum or using motor vehicles or using aeroplanes. I think that is a fundamental shift in Western countries, where now power has shifted out of the hands of our elected politicians into unelected bureaucrats. And this is a disturbing trend which is happening all through the West.
But bureaucrats love bureaucracy. And so, I mean, I can see where you're coming from, both from the deeper philosophical aspect of religion and redemption, and the idea that we mythologize certain parts of our, our contemporary notions. I think that there is an element of that, certainly. Because even speaking to people who are more inclined toward environmentalism, there is this mission that they are wanting to convert you. It's a form of proselytizing, I find. And, again, it's based on what they believe, and what they believe may not be based on science, certainly won't be based on geology, and it will be based on what other people who are critics of geology will say. So you'll have politicians, or political people, I should say, who will be writing books about climate science with no basis of anything other than saying that pollution bad, earth warmer, therefore we must change. And then comes the bureaucracy. Then we put into place all of these things that drive up the prices of almost everything. And you are right. I mean, it's almost part of this Chinese notion of a surveillance state, but from a political perspective, where every part of our life is now being controlled by whether or not we can afford the electrification of our lives. And look at Silicon Valley. All they're promising is more electrification, not less. So we are so dependent on electricity. You would think that it should be a human right for modern industrial societies to have access to cheap, affordable electricity. And yet we're doing the exact opposite. Someone is making money and getting power out of this system. It makes no sense to me at this point in time. And I'm just, an average citizen watching the bills go up with no end in sight. So when are we going to draw the line here? Is it going to be a case of the bills go up as far as they go up until the whole system collapses? Where does this end?
Well, again, you've raised a very large number of points. I would equate the environmental movement to having a Jehovah's Witness knock on your door and try to convert you. Um, and as a scientist, I use evidence, but I can see how science has been absolutely captured and contaminated by politics. Now, you mentioned pollution bad. Well, yes and no. Carbon dioxide is not pollution, it's plant food. And because we're emitting carbon dioxide, it means that people are having healthier and wealthier lives and eating better food and can have food transported to them, etc. And you mentioned the earth warming. There's no evidence for that. I again ask the question, since when? I mean, since the medieval times, the earth has cooled. Since the Little Ice Age, it's warmed. What would you expect? Since the time of Jesus, it's cooled. So we have no evidence, unless you want to bend the truth and say, well, we're going to ignore all the past evidence. I think this is an issue of data, and what's happened is that science has been captured by politicians. You could not get a job as a climate scientist unless you received government grants. There was no job for you. And so we have people who are frightening us witless, using some science to mathematically model what's happening to weather and climate, and trying to frighten us witless, for which they get governments concerned, for which governments give them money. In effect, we're having a group of unemployable people frighten us witless. I see science against politics in this issue. There are some areas of science, and they are climate science and meteorology, which are very minor sciences. My science, geology, is one where we find and create resources that we use in everyday life. For example, in your mobile phone, you use 62 of the 92 elements in the periodic table. So we have a large group of climate scientists who are eminently unemployable. These are people who are mathematical modelers. They don't look at the past. They don't use the coherence criterion of science, and that is that a concept or theory in science has to be in accord with all the other established bodies of science. They don't do that. They totally ignore huge areas of science, frighten us witless. Politicians think, oh, we've got to do something, and these people get funded. It's my view that we have this totally unnecessary area of science, which is a spin-off from meteorology, and we are funding them, and the taxpayers paying for this. So we're paying for that. We're paying for higher electricity. And I have always argued that it will not be the science that will bring this issue to an end. It will be the hip pocket. People are now finding that the costs of electricity are very high. Add to that the cost of subsidies for all of the new networks that we have to put in. Add to that the cost of everything associated with climate science. That has to be put in. Add to that the cost, the additional costs for your food and for anything that's manufactured. That has high energy costs embedded in it. So we've got to a point now in society where things are getting very expensive because of policies which I think are politically incorrect, but they're also not underpinned by science. And to me, the solution is very simple. Just have no subsidies. Say, okay, it's a free market. And if nuclear becomes a power source in the free market, fine. I was just recently in South Korea. 31% of their energy is from nuclear. In South Korea, I saw massive piles of Queensland coal, which is used in their steelworks and for creating electricity. Let the market decide. And the market used to be that the cheapest form of electricity was coal. Victoria once had the cheapest electricity in the world with its huge volumes of brown coal. It was not subsidised. That electricity put water vapour, which is a greenhouse gas, and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, both of which are used by vegetation. So I think we have reached the end of the road now. Everything has become too expensive, be it food, be it anything that's manufactured, be it your electricity. It's not only about electricity, it's about everything. Most of the commodities which we use are imported. They come from countries, say like China, who are using our coal to give them cheap electricity. They add value and sell us something which we pay even more for. So this is really stupid. This is absolutely dumb.
Okay, so all right, we live in a world of politics, Ian. How should policymakers reconcile the geological timelines that we discussed previously with the much shorter democratic and economic cycles they operate in?
Well, policy should be related to common sense. And surveys of 1,084 people to determine political policy are fallacious. Firstly, because it's a very small amount. Secondly, people lie when it comes to being asked questions when they're being interviewed. And the third thing is that the ballot box is the only survey that you can do. If we are to have an energy policy, it has to be based on common sense. And most importantly, it has to be sold very well. Now, an environmental movement can sell fear very easily. It's much easier to frighten someone than to say, look, everything's okay. And so they have won the policy debate because of fear. But the costs are getting so high now, people are saying, oh, I wonder if this really is right. And I wonder if there's a trade-off where I can pay less for energy and less for my commodities and put out carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And in this country, we put out, every year, Australia puts out 17 days of Chinese emissions. So what's the point? Why should we do anything unless China has a massive change, unless India has a massive change, unless Vietnam and the developing world has a massive change? And that question is now being asked. So that's a common sense question. So politicians are only interested in getting re-elected. They're not interested in the health and wealth and long-term future of our nation. And if policy is telling them and the executive of their political party is telling them and the surveys are telling them that we should do this, then they'll do it. But they're not concerned with the long-term future of this country. And the only time you can be concerned with the long-term future of the country is if you have a crisis. And the
Yeah.
crisis could be an economic crisis or a war. And I see that that is the only way Australia will change its view. If we have one of those two, or perhaps both of those, then we will change. We've done it before. We've done it in the last century. We did it with the First World War. We did it with the Depression. We did it with the Second World War. Even before that, the Great Depression of 1890 hit Australia much harder than the 1930s Depression. So I see that we've got to have an absolute economic crisis before we will get common sense. And I think we're suffering from a disease of wealth. We are so wealthy, we can say, "Oh, well, we'll give a slice of this over there." And the problem is when you give one slice, then the forces of darkness come back for a second slice, and then a third slice, and eventually you end up in a situation that we're in.
Yes. Well, there is another aspect that I'd like to raise with you with regard to people seeing things and getting a false positive reading on the whole climate science debate, and that is urban development has seen large swathes of ground bitumized with cement and other things, and we've got buildings and glass towers. And the way that we build our urban infrastructures seems to absorb a lot of heat. We don't put in nearly enough trees around the local suburban areas to act as a bit of a carbon sink or shade or something just to cool things down. And yet we've got people constantly saying, "Oh, it's so hot, it's so unnaturally hot in Adelaide, or it's so unnaturally hot in Brisbane, or it's so unnaturally hot in Melbourne and Sydney." And I would sit back and say, yes, of course it's unnaturally hot because we've papered up. Well, we've basically papered over the landscape with bitumen and glass towers and so on and so forth. And none of this stuff is good at cooling stuff down because it absorbs sunlight and reflects it back out. It's not um, something that would be inducive to having a more comfortable environment, shall we say. What do you say to that?
Well, I think you're on the money. With our urban development, we've done a number of things. We have destroyed good farmland
Yeah,
close to a city. Now, we need good
yeah,
farmland close to a city
yeah,
to provide the vegetables and the fruits.
right.
They don't travel well. They have to be close to a city. The
Mm,
second thing is that we affect the runoff of water.
mm,
And so many of these areas we build on flat country, on floodplains, ends up being flooded. The
yeah,
third thing is we have what is well documented called the urban heat island effect. And these areas become much, much hotter.
mm,
And you can go to some cities. I mean, I'm off to Saudi Arabia in 2 days' time. And in Saudi, there are no trees.
mm,
Yes, you've got these buildings, but the areas in the cities are far, far hotter
yes,
than out in the dunes. And we haven't got enough trees. Now, it's not only the trees absorbing plant food, carbon dioxide, um, they actually change temperature by
mm,
having evaporation of water and absorption of water through the roots.
sure.
They also, I think, beautify an area and they provide oxygen. So we have on planet Earth one of the downsides of having a great population increase
Mm,
is massive urban development. Some of this is, in my view, appallingly ugly.
mm,
I'm not one to live in an apartment on the 14th floor. I prefer to live in a house with a garden.
yeah.
But there's only a limited number of houses with gardens you can have because of the available land and the available water. Um, and there are some areas of Australia which are probably overpopulated. And I would say the Sydney Basin is one of these, where
Sorry, and there's also another thing that came up in conversation the other day, and that was the fact that the housing itself. I mean, there was a time, and I was fortunate enough to grow up during that time, and on such a property, we had over three-quarters of an acre block in Adelaide. Nice, large, landscaped backyard with a swimming pool and all this kind of thing. But now there's this trend to basically subdivide these blocks and build whatever accommodation on them in a way that isn't easily ventilated, isn't naturally cooling. You have low ceilings, which traps the heat, and anyone living inside such housing will often complain about how hot it is. They're going to run their air conditioned 24/7 just to be slightly comfortable. I mean, again, it adds to that sort of false positive notion that there's a global climate crisis, when in actual fact, we're all suffering from the heat island effect, and we just don't want to call it. And again, you mentioned trees. It costs money to grow trees. You're going to have to put in the irrigation necessary in, along median strips and so on and so forth. Would people be tolerating that sort of thing? Like a major program of urban beautification that would probably do a lot to make city life a hell of a lot better than it is now. I don't know.
Well, I think we've got poor architecture for many of these new developments. The block of land is far too small. They're as
Yep,
ugly as sin.
agreed.
I had a little bit older than you. I had an upbringing whereby we had a we had a suburban block of land, big block of land, veggie garden, fruit trees. Our
Correct.
lawnmower was a sheep,
Yep.
which we'd eat our lawnmower every now and then,
Yeah.
and uh, we passed vegetables across the fence to neighbours. He might have had kept chickens, and they passed us eggs.
Yep.
When we went shopping, we only had a basket. We didn't need a supermarket trolley. There were no supermarkets. Air conditioning, well, that was called windows. You'd open or close a window. And if it was cool, you'd put on another layer. If it was warm, you'd end up in shorts and t-shirt. Those were very frugal post-war times,
Yep.
and I don't wish those on anyone. But they were enjoyable times because we had far less pressure on us than people today.
Yep.
I don't know what the solution to it is. I think we are probably overpopulating Australia because of our lack of fertile soils and the lack of rainfall. So um, maybe it's time to house all the people who don't have housing and forget about immigration for a while until we get the country back onto an even keel. Build things which are really energy efficient. Yes, we have little stars on our fridges and saying it's energy efficient, but uh, I've lived in Europe. I've lived in Munich, which was a very, very cold part of Germany, exceptionally well insulated, well heated. Um, in hot summers, yes, you didn't have the flow through of air you needed, but
Yep.
it was pretty well done. And this place is a couple of 100 years old, so
Mm.
I think we have a long way to go yet with having good urban architecture, and especially the parks and gardens and greenery we need to put in.
Would it not then behoove someone out there to actually create the argument to counteract what is the alarmist green sentiment? That we need to look more closely at the design of housing. We need to look more closely at urban design to make life comfortable in the cities. And what sort of political capital would you be able to get from moving down that particular path, do you think?
Well, the first thing is that that doesn't attract any press at all. The press like to have disasters and future catastrophes and
Yeah.
are completely irresponsible and are not they're not held to account for the stories that they write that turn out to be totally wrong. All they're interested in is actually selling the story and move on to the next one. And because the press don't give it great prominence, that means that it's not an issue for the politicians, which means it gets ignored. So
Mm.
what you're doing is talking common sense. Common sense doesn't get a leg up in politics. The only time it does get a leg up is when there is a crisis.
Yeah.
And for decades, we've had politicians, perhaps Pauline Hanson is the exception, but we've had politicians only deal with crisis management, and then the word management is used very loosely. They've dealt with crises. They haven't dealt with the long-term building of the country based on common sense and based on the available resources. So I'm very wary of or sceptical of any solution that uses common sense. It's got to hit the front pages. It's got to hit the 6 o'clock news. If it doesn't, then it's not an issue politically, and nothing will be done.
Oh my God. Okay. Well,
Excuse my
let's.
cynicism.
Yeah. Well, I'm a bit of a cynic myself, Ian, so I think yes, I can understand where you're coming from. All right. So if Australia were to prioritize energy security above all else, what mix of technologies, fossil, nuclear, renewables, storage, would realistically deliver the most stable and affordable supply?
Well, all of them. They all have a place. For example, storage has a place if you're running a hospital and you suddenly need half an hour to convert from one energy system to another. Storage doesn't hold much grunt. It doesn't hold it for a long time. But if you're in the middle of an operation and the power goes, it takes a second or two for a diesel generator to kick in. Storage kicks in immediately.
Yep.
But storage is extraordinarily expensive, and it doesn't have much of a use except for an immediate use of power. There is a use for wind and solar, and we've been using that for decades on outback stations, on phone boxes out in the middle of nowhere, on a signal box on a railway line in the middle of nowhere. But you cannot run an industrial society on sunbeams and sea breezes. It just doesn't have the grunt. And this is why we're putting in a second system, and that second system requires having farmland traversed by power lines, by covering farmland with solar panels, by destroying rainforests in North Queensland with wind systems, and contaminating soils forever. We once had cheap, reliable coal, and that is efficient for more than 90% of the time. And we have had a nuclear reactor now since the late 1950s. We're onto our second reactor. We do have the technology, we do have the people, and the Western world uses nuclear. We export from South Australia 6,000 tonnes of uranium as yellow cake. We export huge amounts of energy in coal. We have millions of years of uranium in this country, thousands of years of gas, thousands of years of coal, and we are trying to demonise this, yet we export it to other people who love it and use it because it's cheap and reliable. So
another example of our hypocrisy.
Well, let the market speak, and the market will go back to coal. It'll go to gas. Gas has got a great use, and that is if you need to suddenly turn on a huge amount of power quickly, gas can do it. Gas, we have to have gas. There are many industries that convert gas into other materials like plastics. It's used in the fertilizer industry. We are currently now importing most of our fertilizer. That's a terribly dangerous position to put this country in. If we get rid of gas, we have to import all of our fertilizer. So we are threatening food security. Gas has a great use. Coal has a great use. What we've done is we've demonised coal. So therefore, those who invest in coal have said, well, we're not taking the risk. We're not going to maintain or invest in new coal facilities because of the community risk from the environmental movement. And this is why we're left ourselves in the situation of old coal-fired generators. Rather than replacing them when they're needed, we've just let them all run down. So I think we let the market speak, but we have to actually have a market that is stable for 50 years or so, because if you build a coal-fired power generator, you need 50 or 70 years of work for it to produce electricity. Its payback period's about 40 years. The same with nuclear. If you build solar or wind, they have less than 20-year life, and that's it. You leave the mess for someone else to clean up. But if you're an overseas investor, and most of the wind and solar companies are overseas countries, they just come in, push up our electricity prices, take the money and run, and leave us with a mess. The rest of the wind and solar companies are owned by Australian super funds run by unions, and hence the union pressure on the Labor Party is such that they are great supporters of wind and solar because they're beneficiaries of it. So I think you just let the market talk, get rid of the subsidies, and work on a 50 or 80 year guarantee period for wind and for everything, for wind, solar, gas, coal, nuclear, and let the market talk.
Okay, so the Liberal Party has recently abandoned its net zero commitment. What do you think this signals for Australia's long-term energy and climate strategy? I mean, does it remove the target? Does removing the target clarify the debate or create greater uncertainty for industry and investment? And, you know, industry and investment don't tolerate uncertainty.
Well, I think the Liberal Party's put itself in a position of being half pregnant, because it's still looking at talking about emissions and talking about Paris.
Yeah.
Either you're in or you're out. And so I think they've created a compromise position, and politics is about compromise. But there are certain issues like the generating of electrons where there's no compromise. You either generate them cheaply or you don't. The best thing the Liberal Party could have done if they want to achieve their aims, and that is to have no net zero, is to create market instability. And you're quite right that if an investor sees that a Liberal Party eventually getting power and might cancel subsidies, then they won't invest. Now, that's already happening in this country. We're getting a decrease in investment in offshore wind. We're getting a decrease in investment in some solar and wind because of community pressures. And if that continues, then the investment will stop and we will have to look at other sources of electricity. So I think the Liberal Party put itself in a very difficult position some while ago, where they had a group of people who probably should have been in the Labor Party and a group of others who were of the same view as their coalition partner, the National Party. It's only one party that's been consistent over time with their energy policy, and that's been Pauline Hanson's One Nation. And then they're such a minor party, they'll never have a sway in government anyway.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so Ian, Australia's economic prosperity is heavily tied to mining. In your assessment, what does responsible mining look like in the 2020s, and how well do we meet that standard today?
Well, Australia, like the US and like a few other countries, has the highest standard in the world. The standards that the mining industry have to adhere to are far greater than the wind and solar industry have to adhere to. If the mining industry had done what the wind industry had done, of clearing rainforests to put up these monstrosities, they would be run out of town. There has been a long history of destruction of the country by mining. You've only got to go to Mount Lyell in Tasmania and to see what was done there. Times have changed, and the mining industry is now very, very tightly regulated. In my view, it is over-regulated. The example, if you build to build the Roy Hill mine in Western Australia, it's an iron ore mine in an iron ore mining province, the Pilbara, in an iron ore mining state, Western Australia, in an iron ore mining country, that's Australia. They needed 4,950 approvals. Now, that is just ridiculous. Basically, you're having approvals by local, state and federal government. These approvals are almost the same. You're keeping an army of bureaucrats employed by ticking boxes, and that is not productive for the country. It cost hundreds of millions. It threatened the investment. There were 19 banks who were funding that project. They got nervous. We've gone overboard with that. So the mining industry has been out of choice and out of force, has turned out to be far more responsible than the so-called environmental friendly wind and solar industries. The heavy metal contamination that you get from mining is far less than you get from solar panels spread across what was farmland or wind turbines spread across what was forests. The second thing is that mining is something which is very long term. So if I have a geological idea for exploration, by the time I get the tenements and do the exploration and successfully review it, and then do some more, and then prove up an ore body, and then go through all the financial and mining analyses and start producing, that'll take 25 years. That's 9 terms of government. So you cannot have the slightest bit of instability, otherwise money runs elsewhere. And that's exactly what's happening in Australia. We are now having money leave Australia, money that's generated in Australia, leaving Australia to go to better jurisdictions where there's less bureaucracy and where it takes less time to go from an idea to actually producing something. We are also under threat. There's always competition there. So, for example, the iron ore deposits in Western Australia have just started to get competition from West Africa, from the Simandou deposit, which will be producing 100 million tonnes of iron ore. That's got to come from somewhere. About 80 million tonnes will probably come from the Pilbara. The rest will probably come out of Brazil. What that means is that there'll be less revenue coming into Australia, less revenue from mining that will go into wages, will go into the companies, will go into taxation. The federal government now will be getting less money from taxation. Now, if mining is frightened away, then this country basically has no taxation base. We become a basket case very quickly, and it takes you 20 years to become a basket case. We saw that with Argentina, we saw it with Venezuela, and it's happening right now in Australia. There is no substantial investment happening now in Australia because of competition, because of the cost of energy. And we look in South Australia, if we want to be parochial, we have the world's biggest lead smelter at Port Pirie.
Yeah.
We have a copper smelter at Olympic Dam, and we have an iron smelter at Whyalla. We have aluminium smelters all up the east coast of Australia in Bell Bay, Tasmania. We had two in Newcastle. We've now only got one. That's Tomago. We've got Gladstone, the Boyne Island smelters now. Aluminium embeds a huge amount of energy. That energy is now costing more money. It is cheaper now to smelt aluminium outside Australia. All of these smelters are now subsidised, and that is nuts. It's subsidised to maintain jobs. The Tomago smelter uses 10% of New South Wales' energy. It's politically good. If you kill off Tomago, you kill off 2,000 odd jobs with a multiplier of 5. So that's 10,000 jobs you kill off. But you keep New South Wales energy prices at a political level that people can handle. If you close off Port Pirie, then you lose thousands of jobs here. There are no other jobs in Port Pirie. There is a multiplier. There are all other industries that hang off Port Pirie. Those lead concentrates can very easily go from the Port of Adelaide to China. They already do. Most of the Broken Hill concentrates for which Port Pirie was built are now going to China. The second biggest user of energy in smelting is zinc. And we have a zinc smelter in Hobart at Risdon, and we have another one and in Townsville. Townsville uses coal-fired electricity. Risdon uses hydroelectricity. Both are subsidised. So both employ a very large number of people. Mining employs people, smelting employs even more people, and all the industries hanging off that employ even more people. So if you want to be anti-mining, and if you want to close down mining, we're going exactly the way Australia is going now to close down mining. And we're having competition come from elsewhere in the world, push out our commodities elsewhere. So China doesn't care where it gets its iron ore from. It's all about the price and the quality. And Simandou is top quality iron ore. It is a cheaper jurisdiction than Australia. Your shipping costs are cheap, and we are going to be losing out from that. So we are under constant threat all the time, and we lose industries, and you can only subsidise them for a certain point of time. We once had 5 car manufacturers in this country. They ended up all being subsidised, and eventually we couldn't subsidise them anymore. We don't make cars any longer. And all the people who made electrical parts and mechanical parts in small factories around those car factories have gone out of business. So there's a multiplier. It flows on, but it takes time. And so we are in Australia at the stage where we are losing industry by industry. So if we lose one smelter, people beat their chest and say, oh, what a tragedy. If we lost them all at once, then it would be a real political disaster. But that's not happening. We lose them one by one as they all struggle to survive. And that's what's happening with mining. There are good jurisdictions around the world. The geology is not as good, but there are good political jurisdictions to work in. Some of the South American countries are really wooing Australians to come there. The Middle East is really wooing Australian companies to come there, and they've got really attractive rocks for mineral deposits. So if you find an ore deposit, you have to go looking for the next one, because it's only going to last you anything from 5 to 25 years, and that's it. You're finished.
And you know, the thing that I'd like to sort of end that session on with is, you know, China. You raised China, and I was going to ask you about the the geographic location of Australia with all the boundless mineral wealth that we have, and you know that we're a stable extractive industry base, that we're not that far from Chinese industry, that they would favor us over and above, you know, going off to Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Latin America, somewhere in Africa. You would think that geography would be our greatest advantage and also our stability. But as you're putting it forward, we're not that desirable because of the bureaucratic red tape that we've let run amok,
Well,
it seems.
Australia is politically stable. We don't change governments with a gun. That
Mm,
happens in many African countries.
yeah,
Um, but we're competing with totalitarian countries
that's right.
where
That's right.
there's enormous political stability.
Yes.
We don't have stability in terms of the bureaucracy. They're making life very, very difficult for producers, and you have to be aware that productivity in Australia is going down. The household GDP is going down. We're already on that slippery slope, and it's getting harder and harder in this country, even though it's attractive in terms of the politics, but in terms of the laws, and the laws are the regulations in the laws that are attached by bureaucrats. It's getting harder and harder. So we have huge instability with regard to what our bureaucrats are doing, enforcing certain regulations. Now, let me give an example of gold. The biggest gold producer in the world is China, and they produce 12 million ounces a year. The second biggest is Russia, at 12 million ounces a year. I don't know what the Australian figure is and the US figures are, but they're less than that. I think they're around about 7 million ounces a year. Now, that enables China to be a very, very wealthy country. It is producing money. That's called gold. Now, the people are having conniptions about how the price of gold has gone up to over $4,000 an ounce.
Yep.
The price of gold hasn't gone up at all. An ounce of gold in the time of Jesus was worth a week of a carpenter's time. It still is. It still is worth a week of a carpenter's time. What has happened is the value of money has gone down. And so various totalitarian countries are building up their financial reserves while we are depleting ours with inflation and the fact that the price of money has changed enormously. There are some countries that have suddenly stopped the export of gold. Mali did that a couple of days ago. They only produce about 2 million ounces a year of gold. But all of a sudden they've said, hey, hang on a tick, we're not going to export money. We're going to keep it in the country. Yeah. In Australia, we are exporting commodities. So if I mine a ton of ore at Broken Hill, well, let me make it a bit different. Let's mine many tons of ore at Broken Hill. Out of that, I will get 1 ton of zinc concentrate. Now, that 1 ton of zinc concentrate, I will have to put on a train system down to the Port of Adelaide. I load it onto a ship, and that ship takes that zinc concentrate to China. And out of that zinc concentrate, they will pay me for 85% of the zinc in it. They will charge me for smelting it, for the use of energy. But they won't pay me for the gold in it. They won't pay me for the silver. They won't pay me for the lead, the cadmium, the selenium, the tellurium, the gallium, and the germanium. So I only get paid a certain amount of the zinc, and then they add value by making something out of zinc or selling us back the zinc metal, which we use for galvanizing to protect steel from rusting. So what we're doing is the supply chain of commodities is such that we will mine the raw commodity and buy the value-added product back. And the only way we can beat that is to have cheap energy. And unless we have cheap energy, we will find that we become a society that goes back to being an agrarian society.
Well, that's exactly where the Greens want to place us, right?
Well, I would like them to lead by example. And I would like a Green to tell me the benefits of being a hunter and gatherer from the front of their cave after they've spent 15 days of foul, rainy weather, hunting and gathering and finding nothing, and freezing cold. They have to lead by example. They cannot use electronic media. They cannot use printing. They cannot in any way use anything in the modern world to promote their message unless they're hypocrites. And when we get Greens flying in private jets to COP conferences around the world, when we're getting Greens use the radio and television networks to promote their message, then they are hypocrites. When they are wearing clothes made out of synthetics or using material where we've used petroleum to make it, then forget it. They're hypocrites.
You're listening to the Focus podcast, where we take the big global debates and put them under the microscope. If you're enjoying today's conversation, please like, subscribe, or share this episode. It helps us bring more world-class voices to this show. All right, now let's get back into the discussion. Right, I think we ought to turn this over to another pressing area, something a little closer to my heart, and that is geopolitics. So, when we talk about the geopolitics of climate change, how do you see climate change intersecting with great power competition, particularly between the United States, China, and Europe? Does the global push towards decarbonization shift the balance of energy security, or simply change who controls which resources?
Well, it's both. We're having China that is producing cheap goods. To do that, they're using our cheap coal. And as a result of them building up their industrial base and their power structure, they now threaten us as a country.
Yep.
They're doing the same to the US. For example, with rare earth elements, China produces some rare earth elements from Bayan Orbo. There are other deposits around in the world, but they don't care about the uranium and thorium, which are throwing everywhere. They're producing rare earth elements, and they can control the processing of the rare earth elements, which they do, and therefore rare earth elements which are needed for electronic equipment and any military equipment is absolutely and totally controlled by China. This is why President Trump is imploring Australia to take a different tack. We do have rare earth elements and new deposits coming on, but we can't process them. We don't have the technology. It's proprietary technology. It's technology which China has stolen mainly from the French and improved it. So in terms of geopolitics, it's all about the cost of energy. It's not who controls the resources. China is geologically very variable and has a great number of resources they can produce. They're a bit short of top quality coals. They're a bit short of top quality iron ore. But they can get that. And if Australia doesn't sell it, then Africa or Brazil will. The whole world is based on cheap energy. Now, Europe has deliberately taken the path of going down the expensive energy route. Well, Europe has basically finished constructing towns and villages and cities. Europe used to make cars. If you want to buy a German car, most of them are made outside Germany now. This was the mainstay of their economy. They have knowingly committed suicide. In the US, Mr. Trump has realized that you need to control energy to have cheap energy, and as a result, he's changed the US into an energy exporting country. It's now got cheap energy, and he's trying to address this geopolitical problem. Australia has always been a country that's exported primary produce, wool, wheat, minerals, but not manufactured metals. We haven't used our minerals to make something. We've just exported the mineral or the concentrate. And that's because we had cheap energy. The technology and cheap energy that other people had, they've still got. We don't. So unless Australia has a very significant change and ends up with cheap energy, it ends up wanting to have various niche manufacturing areas, I see our standard of living continuing to decline.
Assuming for a moment that you could say that Australia is so wealthy, we've got all these rare earths, we've got all these other valuable commodities that we're exporting outwards, why do you think that no Australian government has used this as a method of leverage or power, hard power? Like for instance, we talk about the Chinese threat to Australia from a military perspective, and that's very disconnected from how business in Australia operates. Business in Australia wants to operate with China. They want to make money with China. But the sort of hard security aspect, we want to put some distance between ourselves and China. The only way that we can really do that, I think, is by using what we have as leverage over China. You want to have our stuff? Stop sending your Navy around Australia and conducting live fire exercises off our coast. That would be one way that we could show our displeasure. Do you think we're so desperate for the filthy lucre that we're quite happy to throw national security really under the bus when it comes down to it, because money talks and everything else is a secondary consideration. What are your thoughts?
I don't think governments think like that at all. Governments think from one election to the next. And what you're
You're
talking
even
about
more
long
cynical than
term.
I am.
Yeah, you're talking long term. If we denied China, say, zinc concentrate, they would say, fine, we'll get it from somewhere else. And
Yep.
all that would do would be push up the price of zinc on the international market, but they would get their zinc from somewhere else. If we denied them an iron ore, that would hurt them, but only for a short time. They would invest more in lower grade deposits in Africa and Canada and Brazil and the US, and we would hurt ourselves ultimately. So we're a trading nation. We have to export materials. But the only way I think we can strengthen ourselves is to add value to this material. So it's absolutely crazy that we export cheap coal from Queensland to China. We export zinc concentrate. I use this all the time simply because I opened with it. We export zinc concentrate to China at an international price, at an international shipping rate. And in return, we get zinc metal. And that zinc metal we use to protect iron from rusting by galvanizing. We use zinc for many other reasons, but I use an example which we can all identify with. So we're giving them the concentrate and giving them the energy, and we buy back the added value. That's just nuts. We should be doing it ourselves.
Well, I
And
mean, we could say that, but Ian, we could say that about our agricultural products as well. I mean, there are many things that we could further refine before we sell, and giving ourselves a much greater margin upon selling to a foreign entity. But we're just not
yes,
doing it.
no, we're not. We export food for 80 million people.
Yeah.
It's not only China. A lot of it's, Korea. I think South Korea, I think, is our fourth biggest export market.
Yeah.
We never think of South Korea as being a big market, but we export a lot of food to South Korea. We export coal. We export iron ore. I know that the smelter that I went to 2 weeks ago in Korea at Pohang, they use 12 million tonnes a year of iron ore from Australia. They use coal from Queensland as well as, and they don't expose themselves to having one supplier. They use Indonesian coal as well and coal from Vietnam. So we export a lot of stuff all the way around the world. And anyone, I think, who's in the business of producing doesn't want to be sending their commodity only to one market. You expose yourself too much. So I think we have people here who are pretty aggressive in doing that. But my concern is, and I come back to a parochial example, we used to make cars in Adelaide. We don't.
Yeah.
And that was using steel, which maybe was made in Australia. That was maybe using plastics, maybe made in Australia. But we certainly had a lot of modest sized businesses around that might be making hydraulic cables, might be making nuts and bolts sitting around the factory. And they would employ people. They would be galvanizing those nuts and bolts before the car was galvanized. We had a manufacturing industry.
Yep.
We couldn't possibly do it any longer.
That's just sad. Okay, so if we talk about Prime Minister Albanese's recent deal with Donald Trump with regard to the sale of Australian rare earths to the United States. Now, some people in the Labor Party consider now Albo the Trump whisperer. I have my doubts. I also think that perhaps, I'm much more nationalistically inclined in terms of I hope that our political leaders will drive the best bargain possible. But with regard to past political practice, I would imagine that we got what we got from the United States, but the US always has the strong arm. They are the bigger power. They can put more weight on us, and they will get what they get out of Australia for a cost that suits them, not necessarily for a cost that suits the Australian government. What do you think of the Albanese-Trump rare earths deal? Do you think it's going to be good for us in the long term? Do you think he drove the best deal possible for us? I mean, it's America first for them, but I don't know. Our Australian politicians don't seem to follow that guideline for Australia first.
Well, this deal wasn't done by Albanese. It was a deal where years ago, the US Geological Survey approached Matt Canavan when he was Minister for Resources.
Right.
The US Geological Survey not only employs a lot of geologists, they employ spooks. And I have met people from the USGS who are in the CIA. I had one situation with a discovery in Australia, and a byproduct was the metal rhenium. Now, there's only 75 tonnes a year of rhenium that are produced worldwide. It came from three sources. Australia looked as if it was going to be the biggest provider of rhenium in the world. And rhenium is used to alloy in turbine blades of jet aeroplane fighters. If you have a rhenium alloy there, you can spin that turbine faster. You can make your jet go faster. It's got direct strategic military uses. And I was at a conference. I gave a paper on this rhenium deposit. And I had a chap come up to me from the US Geological Survey. That's what his badge said, USGS. And he handed me his business card and it said CIA. And you could tell from the crew cut and the way he was dressed, he was CIA. Right. So the CIA keep very, very close checks on who's got what and what resources are what. So this deal was started, the negotiation started years and years ago, and the USGS are always talking to Australian mining companies. Right. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that Mr. Trump is looking at breaking the deadlock of processing of rare earth element deposits. The US used to be the biggest producer of rare earth elements in the world, and that was from their Mountain Pass deposit, which closed for environmental reasons. It is being reopened, and the concentrate is being processed in China to make military metals for the US. Now, Australia does have a rare earth element processing plant. It's in Malaysia. There's one being built in Texas, and there's one going to be built in Fremantle. So it's not that Mr. Trump is chasing the rare earth element minerals. The US does have some coming out of Mountain Pass in California. They do have a few in the mineral sands of Georgia and Florida. We have been selling the mineral monazite from our mineral sand mining to China for a long while. That selling stopped about 20 years ago, and those monazite concentrates have been stockpiled in Western Australia. Mr. Trump has got his eyes on those because there's a plan to have a plant to treat that stockpile. We have in central Victoria an area where there's a very large amount of mineral sands. This is inland, well above sea level, again showing that sea levels go up and down like a yo-yo. They go up and down by 600 metres, and for most of the time, sea level's been 300 metres higher than now. So everything we hear about sea level is just absolute nonsense. But these old mineral sand deposits in beaches near Horsham and going across to the east from Horsham towards Bendigo have got a lot of rare earth element minerals in them. The USGS is clearly aware of these because we are in Australia. And so they present a source where they could go through a rare earth element plant. This is one of the few areas where we are ahead of the US in technology, is converting rare earth element minerals into rare earth element oxides. We don't have the technology to convert the rare earth element oxides into rare earth element metal boron compounds used in magnets, in your headphones. Everyone listening to this podcast would be using rare earth elements. Your iPhone's got rare earth elements in it, only a few grams. Every laser guided missile's got rare earth elements in it. Every aeroplane has got rare earth elements in it. We need them. So Mr. Trump is after our technology combined with some of our deposits, but you can get rare earths from elsewhere in the world. And the potential places, besides the existing Mount Weld deposit in Western Australia, the future Nolan's Bore in the Northern Territory, and the future mineral sands in Victoria and Western Australia, we can go to Greenland. There are rare earth element deposits there. There are some in the US. There are quite a few in Africa. Mozambique's got plenty of mineral sand rare earth element deposits. So Mr. Trump has got very good advice and a strategic advice saying we need to have a supply coming through. We have to stop having rare earth elements processed in China. Now, he's done a deal with China where there's a stay of execution for a short time, such that he can continue to have US rare earths processed in China. Now, the second point to your question is that we have done this deal. I don't think Mr. Trump is aware of how difficult it is to build a factory or to convert products in a smelter into something that's usable. And he might be draining the swamp in his country, but it has yet to be done in this country. And I just don't think the Albanese government could deliver on what they promised. But I think Albanese was swept away with attention from Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump had every reason to smack him around the ears, but he didn't. He was swept away with the attention, and we have to deliver. And yeah. I don't think we can. We don't have the bureaucracy that can do it.
Oh my God. Anyway, many developing nations, Ian, argue that climate targets imposed by wealthier countries restrict their economic growth. Do you see climate policy becoming a new form of geopolitical pressure or leverage between states? And here, I'm more particularly interested in what you have to say about the emerging BRICS countries, because, you know, they are under Russia, China tutelage of sorts. They are representing this new form of capitalist autocracy, which you made mention earlier. So, what do you think of that?
Well, developing nations, many of them are totally and absolutely ignoring any of the climate constraints put on them by Europe and the UN. They need to feed their people. They need to educate their people. I work a lot in the developing world as a geologist, and they're concerned about whether their kids can get an education. They're concerned about whether they can eat. They're concerned about land title. They're concerned about things which the West doesn't concern itself with at all. So they are in many ways ignoring what is being pushed by Europe especially and the UN. The second thing is that Russia and China don't have all the commodities they need to be growing totalitarian states. They need it from other sources. Russia and China don't have a geology that allows them to have every commodity, nor do we in Australia, but we've got almost every commodity we need for an industrial society. So they're securing that they've got a supply of the commodities that they need to be an authoritarian military nation. They're not concerned about development in Brazil. They're not concerned about whether an African country can feed itself or not. They're only concerned about what commodities they need to keep their machine operating. So again, I'm fairly cynical about this, but there is a reality. There are countries like Brazil that has a geology that allows it to produce certain commodities that Russia can't do. There's a country like South Africa that can produce a large amount of, say, platinum and palladium and osmium, iridium, which are absolutely necessary for converting petroleum, crude oil into the various fractions we use. And very few other countries can produce these commodities. So some countries have almost got control of commodities. And I mentioned South Africa. Well, commodities like chromium, vanadium, and the platinum group elements, the 6 platinum group elements, are virtually come out of South Africa. There are very, very few come out of other countries. And so this is why Russia and China do a deal with South Africa. The other provider of platinum group elements is the Norilsk area in Siberia. So if you can control platinum, you can stop the Western world converting crude oil into diesel, into aviation fuel, into petrol. You can stop the conversion of chemicals into plastics. So there are very good reasons for having BRICS.
Okay, so there's another pressing geopolitical issue that affects Australia directly, and that is the fact that we have our major strategic petroleum reserve somewhere in Texas rather than somewhere in Australia, giving us a relatively short supply in country of petrol and diesel to keep our industries running and our people going to work. How big a problem do you think this is now that the world is moving to a greater level of instability and the likelihood of conflict is rising? Any thoughts on that?
Australia has put itself in a critically dangerous position. Our petroleum reserves in the Bass Strait are almost exhausted. We have a little bit of petroleum that comes out of Queensland and the Northern Territory and South Australia, but that's residual petroleum. Some of it's condensate from gas, but some of it is that these oil fields are getting old. We produce a little bit out of the Perth Basin, and we produce some from the Northwest Shelf, and it's far easier to export that to Singapore for refining than it is to take it around to the 2 refineries in Australia. We once had 8 refineries. We now have 2. We do not have the ability to produce the crude oil that we need in this country. We don't have the ability to refine it if we did. We import most of our petroleum products from super refineries in Singapore and in India. If we close the seaways, and that happened in the Second World War, we have no supply of petroleum. Whether we have a stockpile, and we should under international agreements have a 90-day stockpile, it's in the order of 21 days. We've got a little bit stored in Texas. So what? How the hell do we get it to Australia?
Well, that's the point, right?
So we have created a problem for ourselves. This has been known for a long while, and governments have totally ignored it because this doesn't win you elections. We do have, however, in this country, a very large amount of petroleum sitting in brown coal in Victoria, and you can extract that from the brown coal. You can do what Germany did in the Second World War and convert that brown coal into diesel. The technology is there. We also had in embargoed times, and because South Africa has no oil, they have technology, the Sasol process for converting black coal into petroleum products, and we have an enormous amount of black coal that is not of the quality to use for coking coal or for steaming coal, but we could convert it into petroleum. But we don't have any of these plants anywhere in Australia. You could set one up outback South Australia in Arkaringa Basin. You could set one up at Lee Creek. Very easy to do. The third thing is that in the First World War, we used some of our oil shales, and these are a type of coal where instead of using plant stems, plant leaves, which get fossilized into coal, we use pollen and spore that gets fossilized. And if you heat those oil shales, you produce a gas which you condense and create petroleum products. These are sometimes called kerosene shales. These were mined in Tasmania, in New South Wales, and in Queensland during the First World War to produce oil. So that again would take years to put into practice. Again, you'd have environmental laws against you. So we do have material, but it would take years to use existing technology to give us the oil. We are now getting in the Beetaloo Basin in the Northern Territory. We're getting pipelines built. We're getting some discoveries of gas. There's some condensate coming out of that. Australia doesn't have much oil, but it does have quite a lot of gas. We have gas which you could convert into oil, but again, this would be a very expensive process, and we would take years of applying existing technology. So Australia is like a shag on a rock strategically. We're in the same position we were in 1939. We're in the same position we were in 1913. We are exposed. Our seaways couldn't carry the petroleum we need, and this is the excellent argument to use to have a huge amount of electricity generated by using nuclear rather than diesel.
But then again, as you have rightly pointed out, that will also take years. So what do you know about American developments in miniaturized nuclear power plants, which apparently are going to be able to be used at very local levels? There, you don't have to have the the Simpsons 1950s power plant in the background. You can actually have very small, very safe nuclear reactors in municipal areas that would be able to cover the municipality.
Well, this is old technology. We've had it in nuclear submarines since the 1950s.
Yep,
People are having conniptions saying, oh, this is new technology. We don't want to experiment with it. Well, read a bit of history. This is absolute nonsense. It's an ideal technology for Australia. Now, yes, it's expensive, but it's also expensive putting in power lines and maintaining those power lines. I was in Broken Hill earlier in the week. Broken Hill used to have 2 diesel generating stations. One, the Galena Street station that was used for the town, and the other in Air Street, the central power station, was used for power and compressed air for the mines.
Yeah.
They have now closed because the diesel used to have to come from South Australia on the rail system, and they have a power line that comes in from Victoria. Now, that's a over 300-kilometre long power line that's been knocked out a couple of times now with lightning. The steel is not galvanised on the stanchions that are holding up the power lines. That's creating great problems. It's a corrosion problem. You could use one of those old power stations, huge power station, 6-foot thick concrete floors, to put in a small modular reactor. Now, these reactors would keep a town like that of 18,000 people going and going perfectly well. You don't have to worry about maintaining hundreds of kilometres of power lines. Perfect. There are plenty of outback towns where you could do this. I'm not so sure once you've got existing grids where it would work in South Australia, maybe Mount Gambier, Whyalla, Port Pirie could have it. But places like Mount Isa, Alice Springs, absolutely perfect. Alice Springs used to be diesel. Just the cost of running a generator at Alice Springs was enormous. So for Australia, where you do have modest-sized population centres, especially in industrial towns, where you use a lot of power, any mine worth its salt will use anything from 6 to 25 gigawatts of power, megawatts of power, should I say. Perfect, absolutely perfect. So this is technology that's been around. We should have explored it seriously, but because we have very squeaky wheels living in cities and they never get out of their city abode, they have no idea what goes on out back. Politicians listen to them because the votes are city-based, and the politicians are only concerned about getting re-elected. They're not concerned about building a nation.
You know, some defense establishments view climate change as a threat multiplier, affecting migration patterns, water scarcity, and regional stability. From your perspective, Ian, are these concerns grounded in evidence, or do they reflect a broader shift in how militaries frame environmental issues based on public sentiment?
I don't think the military should be concerned about environmental issues. I'm sure when they're bombing a city or firing shells at an army, they're not concerned about the environmental impact of a shell landing and disturbing farmland and killing people. But there are strategic risks in not having independent supplies of energy for water and for food and for any mobile equipment. So, and again, these are you cannot have constraints on diesel-driven equipment or maybe rockets that are being fired that are putting out gases into the atmosphere. I think you've got to be concerned about winning the battle rather than concerned about the short-term environmental effects. And yes, wars do create environmental damage, but the military, quite rightfully, is concerned about strategic supply of commodities, metals, food, energy. The military has to be concerned about military metals, such as tungsten. We have one small tungsten in Australia, mine in Australia at King Island in Tasmania, and you have to be concerned about it.
Professor Plimer, whether people agree with your conclusions or challenge them, you force us to think harder about the assumptions driving climate science, environmental policy, and energy strategy. Thank you for joining us on The Focus and for engaging with these questions in depth.
And thank you for the longest podcast I've ever done.
Oh, yes.
The second one for the day, but the longest one.
Fantastic. What I can take away from this discussion is just how important it is to sit with complexity, even when the views expressed push against the mainstream. I've spent decades working in defense strategy and international affairs, and the one thing that I've learned is that certainty is often the enemy of understanding. For me, what matters is open dialogue, evidence tested in public, and ideas put under pressure. Thank you for being part of that process. Now on to questions for the audience. Do you think Australia's climate and energy policies are driven more by science, economics, or politics, and why? Has this conversation changed how you view the relationship between climate science, energy security, and geopolitics? Which arguments in today's discussion resonate most with you, and what evidence informs your view? Let us know in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have comments or questions about the podcast? Post them into the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producers of The Focus, Neil Smart and Lynn Sear. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at Bruni Doctor and follow The Focus on X at @thefocus_sage. And don't forget Blue Sky on the Focus Pod adl.bsky.social. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.